Awesome. So as we mentioned, this is part of Domestic Violence Awareness Week, responding to the COVID-19 crisis, and it's organized by the COVID-19 Task Force on Domestic Violence. And this topic will be the intersection of domestic violence and politics. So just a little bit of a background about Domestic Violence Awareness Week. If you've been to one of our other events, you probably have heard, but just for new people, we'll say, we have created this week in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which occurs every October. Essentially, we created this week of Zoom events that'll feature both the work of task force members and community partners, with the ultimate goal of promoting domestic violence awareness within the context of this unprecedented time in history. And our programming aims to be accessible to those with and without a background in domestic violence work. Today's will be a pretty introductory, basic level session on the intersection of politics and domestic violence. And so if you have no background in kind of domestic violence work or anything like that, this will hopefully be a great session for you to learn so that you can keep all the new things in mind for future events. Cool. A small disclaimer that we do at the beginning of some of our sessions is just to note that we aren't necessarily experts in the field. We all come from primarily academic backgrounds working within the domestic violence or gender violence world. And so this presentation will consist of various things that we've learned through trainings, experiences, and then lots of sources. And we cite as we go. So please do feel free to go into all the citations that we leave and let us know if you have any questions or anything at all. And a quote we like to say is, we all have things to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And then very quickly, I'd like us to maybe introduce ourselves, who will be presenting, just so you guys know. As I said, I'm Lita, and I'm originally from New York, but I'm currently in London. Who wants to go next? Sanj.
Hi, I'm Sanjana. I use the she, her pronoun series, and I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. Alyssa?
Hi, I'm Elisa. I'm from Toronto, Canada, and am currently in Toronto, Canada.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Friedman. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm from New Jersey, but currently in Chicago.
Awesome. So we will be your presenters tonight, just so you know a little bit more about us. To start off, we just want to say that at the task force, the COVID-19 Task Force for Domestic Violence, we do define domestic violence as abuse within the domestic environment. And so this includes intimate partner violence, child abuse, and elder abuse. But for the focus of most of our work in this presentation specifically, we'll kind of be looking at domestic violence as related to intimate partner violence, and that includes dating violence, stalking, sexual violence, etc. Another quick note on language, we choose to use the term survivor versus victim when talking about domestic violence, but we do, of course, respect that many people who have experienced domestic violence may refer to themselves as victims, victim survivors, or another term. And of course, we respect everyone's language choices. So just keep that in mind. Awesome. Just so everyone knows what we're kind of going to be talking about today, the agenda. Basically, we have 5 main parts. The first part is we're going to look through key pieces of domestic violence legislation and kind of give an introduction so everyone's on the same page of what it currently exists in both the United States and then a little bit about Canada. We're also going to talk about mandatory arrest laws in domestic violence. Then, because next week, a week from today, is the election in the United States, we'll be talking about barriers to voting for survivors of domestic violence, which is a super topical kind of topic at the moment. And then we'll hopefully brainstorm some action steps together. And if we have time, kind of go into a bit of a discussion about people's thoughts about the intersection of domestic violence and politics and what we can do to kind of help in the political sphere. And then finally, we'll have some information about how you can get involved with the task force or reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns. So getting started with key pieces of domestic violence legislation. I'm not sure what kind of background people on this call have, so we'll kind of just be talking about the really basic main ones that you should kind of get to know. So Unfortunately, they're all very complicated though, and so I'm doing my best to kind of just give you a very broad bone kind of overview. So one of the most important pieces of legislation for domestic violence is the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. And this was enacted in 1994 and sponsored by then Senator Joe Biden. And it was part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. So essentially, VAWA intends to, one, change attitude towards domestic violence, foster awareness of domestic violence. So previously to VAWA, in the 70s and 80s, domestic violence was really seen as something that was private, belonged in the home, wasn't necessarily a government, federal, political thing. So this tried to kind of foster awareness of domestic violence within kind of the community and the government sphere. Also, it improves services and provisions for victims of domestic violence or survivors. And it revised the manner in which the criminal justice system hopefully would respond to domestic violence crimes. Another main thing that it did through this kind of latter point is create a coordinated community response model. And so this essentially encourages jurisdictions to bring together lots of different players, from advocates to police officers, prosecutors, judges, people within the prison and probation system, health professionals, etc., to kind of share information and brainstorm how we can best improve community responses to domestic violence. Another main thing that VAWA did was create the Office of Violence Against Women. And this is now the office that is in charge of distributing federal grants to state, tribal, local governments, nonprofit organizations, and universities. So one of the main funding sources. Another huge thing that's still really important today is that VAWA created the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And so this is a free hotline that people can call into in the United States. It also extended kind of federal power, because the way it works in the United States, for those that aren't too familiar, is that we have state laws for all 50 states, but we also have kind of a federal code. And because VAWA was a federal act, it basically made it so that all of the different laws across states, or survivors in all different states, would kind of receive the same protection across the states at a federal level. And then another main thing that's, I think, interesting that VAWA did was create the federal rape shield law. And for people that don't know, rape shield law is basically creates a bar against the use of a survivor's past sexual behavior within a complainant of a rape in a rape case. So essentially, a survivor's past sexual behavior can't be used against them in cross-examination, although there are some exceptions. So those are kind of some of the main things that VAWA did and that we still really see the impact of today. VAWA gets reauthorized ever so often. And so kind of the main trend that you'll see with VAWA reauthorizations is that it's trying to protect more people, more vulnerable people, and kind of change with the tides of society. And so in 2000, you see immigrants being discussed in VAWA reauthorizations to make sure that they are protected, elderly and disabled women. Also expanding kind of the definition of just domestic violence to also include sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. 2005, you saw landmark housing protections, as well as kind of a focus on creating culturally and linguistically specific services and funding those. In 2013, you saw enhanced protections for Native Americans and LGBTQ plus survivors. And there was also an inclusion of the need to address the national rape kit backlog. And so if you were to get a rape kit done in the United States, which is a forensic exam after an assault, you can have the kit done, but there's a huge backlog to actually get it analyzed. And so this tried to create funding to help that. Then in April 2019, there was supposed to be another reauthorization of VAWA. And it basically had no rollbacks on current protections and some other things. But one of the main issues was it had to do with guns. specifically the boyfriend loophole, in that if you had been committed, if you had had a domestic violence charge on you, you weren't allowed to get access to firearms. And basically the NRA, which is the National Rifle Association, had a lot of issues with that. And so it passed in the House, which is one part of the US Congress, in April 2019, but it so far has not passed in the Senate. And hopefully, well, I won't say anything. We'll see what happens, essentially, to be continued. But yeah, so as you can kind of see, VAWA has done some really incredible things that are still with us today. And there have been lots of reauthorizations throughout the years to try to get it to protect more people, especially those that are more vulnerable. In addition to VAWA, there's also VOCA, another great acronym. This was before VAWA in 1984. It's the Victims of Crime Act, and it basically established the Crimes Victims Fund to assist and compensate survivors of crimes. And so this wasn't necessarily domestic violence focused, but it was about all crime victims, specifically saying that giving grants to states so that states could fund victim services. So this did include domestic violence direct service providers, although it wasn't necessarily the only focus. And then also just to be able to compensate victims for crime-related expenses. So VOCA is another really important one. Specifically for domestic violence, another important piece of legislation to know is the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. And this was part of the Child Abuse Amendments of 1984. And it's actually the primary source of federal funding for domestic violence direct service providers in the United States. And so it is another very helpful act specifically for nonprofit organizations and service providers. And then, as I mentioned, obviously, the United States has a interesting relationship with guns, and essentially there was an amendment called the Lautenberg Amendment, I think I'm pronouncing that, of 1996, which basically prohibits people convicted of domestic violence from possessing firearms. But now they're trying to now that's kind of a point of controversy for getting it past the Senate, because obviously one might like to see even more protections. But those are kind of some of the main pieces of domestic violence legislation in the United States, or legislation that kind of directly affects domestic violence service providers or survivors themselves. More recently, we have the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, which is CARES Act. And although this was kind of just a comprehensive stimulus package, it was notable that $45 million in funding was given for domestic violence services and programs, and $2 million in funds for the National Domestic Violence Hotline to ensure that it could continue to exist throughout the pandemic. So that is good. However, there was a lot of that we hoped would be changed before it was passed, and that we would hope to see change if there's another stimulus bill. Specifically, domestic violence organizations have strongly urged our Congress to ensure that a future stimulus package expands basically comprehensive support for programs, not just for domestic violence, but also sexual violence. Specifically, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence has called for Congress to, sorry about that, called for Congress to waive VAWA and VOCA match requirements, and they also call on Congress to ensure the sustainability of the Crimes Victims Fund. So there are some things that are kind of needing to happen in the future. The final piece of legislation that I want to talk about is perhaps a little bit more applicable to a lot of us on the call, as we're probably a relatively young crowd. And this is Title IX. And this is essentially what is applicable to those in universities in the United States, so students. Title IX, essentially under Betsy DeVos, who's in the Department of Education, under her new guidelines of Title IX. She just changed them this year. It's Title, there are a few issues. Basically, there have been some key revisions that are a little frustrating. First, sexual harassment has been more narrowly redefined as unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, unwelcome conduct on the basis of sex that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies a personal access to the school's education. In addition to a definition change, there is also a key revision that says that schools must act if a formal complaint has been filed or if the school is aware of multiple reports of the same person, which is good. However, schools must dismiss off-campus complaints. And so that's definitely a key revision that is perhaps not great for survivors. Another one is, as part of the response to a complaint, colleges and universities must now provide due process, not only to the victim, but the one being accused, which is of course hypothetically great, but this now includes a live hearing with cross-examinations of the survivor, of the person that is filing the complaint of sexual harassment. And of course, a cross-examination can be super traumatizing, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fact that this is now kind of the standard for a college level or a university level complaint is not ideal. Specifically, also schools can require the plaintiff to prove that the sexual harassment occurred with little doubt, probably not without doubt, but with little doubt, yes. But essentially, it's a clear and convincing standard, and this isn't necessarily the standard that was used before. And so essentially, lots of people, specifically domestic violence, sexual violence organizations focused on relationship violence in young people, are saying that these revisions might make survivors less likely to come forward and kind of have a more traumatic process in doing so. So that is another piece of legislation from the United States relating to domestic violence. And now we'll learn a little bit about Canada.
Okay, hi everyone. So switching gears, we're going to talk about some Canadian pieces of legislation related to domestic violence. I do want to preface that this is not exhaustive. There are a lot of individual, provincial, and territorial legislative things that I'm not going to go over today, but I do want to go over some of the main ones. So similarly to the US, Canada operates on a federal and then provincial and territorial system. So much like your state systems, Canada has specific legislation that is provincial or territorially bound. And then we also have federal legislation that applies to all of Canada. So in Canada, we don't really have a federal act right now that addresses domestic violence across the country. Instead, domestic violence and intimate partner violence are often dealt with through the criminal code offenses or through provincial and territorial legislation. So the criminal code, I'm going to spend a little bit talking about. If we can just switch to the slide before this one. Thank you. No. There we go. Okay. So the criminal code was enacted in 1985, and since then it's been updated quite a lot to include new offenses, new provisions for sentencing, bail, all of those things. But right now, the criminal code doesn't have a standalone offense for intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So when somebody brings a case of domestic violence into the criminal system in Canada, it's often dealt with through a variety of conducts and offenses that can be committed against an intimate partner. So these are things like assault, which can include assault causing bodily harm, assault with a weapon, or aggravated assault. It can also include kidnapping and forcible confinement. You also have sexual assault. So there's different levels of this as well. Similarly to assault, you have sexual assault causing bodily harm, sexual assault with a weapon, and aggravated sexual assault. You also have criminal harassment, which can include stalking, anything in terms of like sending threats, which is a subsection of criminal harassment. And then to the highest tier, which is homicide. Again, this is not exhaustive of everything, but these seem to be the ones that are most commonly invoked when we have cases of domestic violence or IPV in Canada. So as you can see, the criminal code is not exhaustive, and we don't have a defined offense of intimate partner violence within the criminal code. And it's, even though we've got things that touch on stalking, forcible confinement, sexual assaults, so those physical and sexual aspects of domestic violence, we don't really have anything that strictly criminalizes economic, mental, physical, or emotional and social abuse experienced by victims of domestic violence. And criminalizing only some of the behaviors associated with intimate partner violence, particularly with regards to the violent and sexual offenses, allows cases containing more subtle aspects of DV, like manipulation or economic abuse, to fall through the cracks of our justice system and not be addressed through the criminal route. The other big thing is that the criminal code doesn't outline specific provisions for family violence, namely child abuse. So instead, these are often addressed through offenses related to sexual and physical violence against children, like child pornography, and a specific statute that addresses sexual offenses against children and youth, and offenses related to neglect. So these are included under failure to provide necessities of life, abandoning a child, and criminal negligence. Because the definitions are so narrow, you often have instances of IPV and domestic violence that fall outside of the already established statutes in the criminal code. So recently in 2019, we introduced Bill C75 to amend some aspects of the intimate partner stipulations in the criminal code. So some of the key revisions that were introduced are that Bill C75 clarifies the definition of an intimate partner to include a current or former spouse, a common law partner, or a dating partner. So we finally broadened that definition from just marriage, a current marital partner, to include all of these other forms of relationships. I do admit 2019 is a little late for Canada to be doing that, but I digress. It also creates a reverse onus at bail for somebody who's been accused and charged with a violent offense involving an intimate partner if they've previously been convicted for violence against an intimate partner. It also allows a higher maximum penalty in cases involving an offender who has a history of intimate partner violence. And it clarifies that strangulation constitutes a higher level of assault and a more serious type of sexual assault. There are also little things about law related to Indigenous aspects for both offenders and victims that are outlined in Bill C75. Just for time, I didn't want to go into them, but it's very important that we consider Indigenous peoples in our lawmaking, and also consider that those are mitigating factors in our decisions around IPV and domestic violence. So some of the current issues with Bill C75, a lot of rights organizations in Canada have noted that this is still too narrow and it doesn't do enough for victims and survivors of intimate partner violence. So particularly the reverse onus stipulation is really, really narrow, and it doesn't apply to anyone without a previous conviction for domestic violence. So if somebody has a documented history of stalking, manipulation, all of those things that we know can lead to more intense forms of DV, they aren't captured under this revision. This also applies to offenders who have received absolute or conditional discharges for offenses related to domestic violence. In addition, while the maximum sentences for intimate partner violence are raised, Canada's courts rarely impose maximum sentences for domestic violence, so that doesn't really do much for us. The other main thing with both the criminal code and all of the criminal code revisions is that they are retroactive. So they respond to domestic violence after it's occurred, and little is done to promote protection for vulnerable populations before instances of DV and IPV occur. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we also have provincial and territorial legislation. Again, much like your state laws, these will vary by province and territory. So far, we have 9 provinces and territories that have enacted specific legislation aimed at family and domestic violence. So from the names here, you can sort of tell that nobody is really in agreement about what their acts are addressing. So out west, you have more of a focus on family violence, whereas in the middle prairies, you have domestic violence being actively named. Manitoba has also named stalking in their act, which is fantastic. Ontario and Nova Scotia, again, sort of east central, have also directly named their acts domestic violence related things. And then as you get further out east, it goes back to family violence. So within that, you have a lot of spread between what, first of all, what we're talking about. So some provinces and territories are looking at family violence, which may not be inclusive of all of the aspects of domestic violence that we know. For instance, people who are not in an established family in a dating relationship may fall outside of these family-focused prevention acts. Similarly, on the flip side, if you're focusing on specific aspects of DV, it may not fall under family violence as well. It may only look to that IPV aspect. So that's one of the issues. There are a few other current issues with our legislation, not only just the spread of what the acts are called and what they address, but each act has a different definition of what constitutes domestic violence or family violence. So for instance, in Manitoba and the Yukon Territory, they recognize that psychological and emotional abuse are key components of DV, whereas in Saskatchewan and Alberta, these aren't really things that are addressed. It's mainly their definition of family and domestic violence are focused on those physical and sexual aspects. The criminal justice responses also vary between provinces and territories with these dedicated legislations. So some of these acts outline warrants and compensation, whereas others are focused on emergency protection orders and victims assistance orders. Several provinces and territories also still don't have dedicated legislation to address domestic violence. So right now, British Columbia, Nunavut, Quebec, and New Brunswick still don't have a dedicated act in 2019. In these provinces and territories, victims are often just encouraged to report to police, seek aid through local victims organizations, and attend a shelter or seek out safe shelter if needed. But again, like everything else, the aid available and the CJS responses to things will vary by jurisdiction. So all in all, this sort of results in a piecemeal approach to domestic violence across the country, which changes drastically based on the jurisdiction. So I'm going to hand it over and we're going to talk about mandatory arrest laws and domestic violence.
Thank you. Hi, guys. Yeah, kind of shifting from legislation to talking about policing and the history of policing and how that's been relied on as a solution for domestic violence, specifically in regards to mandatory arrest laws. So early to mid of the 20th century, domestic violence and intimate partner violence was largely considered a private matter. And so the law enforcement didn't really utilize arrests very often. This didn't really change till the 60s, 70s, and honestly, even the 80s, when mainstream feminists and battered women's movement activists tried to adopt a more aggressive criminal legal response to domestic violence. So one of the studies that was born from this movement was the Minneapolis Domestic Violence Experiment, MDVE. You may see this cited in numerous places, but this, which has been kind of declared controversial, concluded that arrests act as a deterrent against future violence. However, since it's been published, it has been widely criticized, and replicated studies have found no evidence of the deterrent effect of arrest. However, based on this study, some legislation, including the 1994 VAWA, or the Violence Against Women Act that Lita mentioned, included mandatory arrest policies in their framework. So France, 2 states that adopted more aggressive mandatory arrest policies to allow police intervention in the absence of victim cooperation and to combat what many perceive as police action in cases of domestic violence. But in practice, such policies actually escalated violence. In 2007, state laws And one potential explanation is because victims just had less say in what was going on. And also because police sometimes, oh, can you all hear me?
Sorry, your Wi-Fi is cutting in and out, so you're kind of a little spotty.
I apologize. How's it now? Better? Worse? Let me move. Try this. Part 2.
Might help also to turn your video off.
I can do that. How about now? Better. I apologize. So I'll go back a little bit, but as I mentioned, this Minneapolis study was cited as a basis for, in Wawa, they provided federal grants to states that adopted more aggressive mandatory arrest policies. And they did that to allow police intervention in the absence of victim cooperation, or also if complaints were withdrawn, and to combat what many perceived as police inaction in cases of domestic violence. So while it was well intended, this policy actually may have contributed to increased violence. A 2007 study observed that states with mandatory arrest laws had a significantly higher rate of intimate partner homicides. And one potential explanation for this is that victims may have been less likely to report domestic abuse when they have little say in the outcome. Another situation is that when it is unclear, so for instance, if both parties are injured, under mandatory arrest laws, police can perform and are actually more likely to perform what is called dual arrests. So arresting both the victim as well as the perpetrator. So a victim who fights back in self-defense could also end up charged, which further disincentivizes reporting. So through the 2005 VAWA reauthorization, it began promoting pro-arrest policies instead. Mandatory arrest policies are still in effect in 21 states and in Ontario, Canada. So kind of as I discussed, it's really important to consider the impact of mandatory arresting and especially the reliance on law enforcement and pro-arrest policies to address domestic violence in terms of historically over-policed communities, such as the Black and Indigenous communities, and how they are disproportionately affected. So I touched on a few of these issues. So dual arrests doesn't take into account survivors' preferences, discourages reporting, but most importantly, it doesn't address the root cause of domestic violence, and it has not been shown to deter future violence. Next slide. Yeah, so some potential reforms that activists have been promoting are mandatory action as opposed to mandatory arrest. So rather than forcing police to make an arrest in cases of suspected domestic violence, letting them choose from a variety of actions based on the context. So that could include offering transport to a shelter, connecting survivor with resources, allowing for short-term protection, or even, making a request or assisting the survivor in obtaining a protection order, an emergency protection order, if necessary, and only at the survivor's request. Another potential reform, which is important to talk about, especially in regards to funding and talking about defunding the police, is the support and funding of second response teams. So these are teams of victim advocates and social service providers that respond to the scene to provide crisis intervention, emergency treatment, and referrals. Thank you.
Next, we're going to discuss barriers to voting for survivors of domestic violence. And as those in the US know, our election day is next week on November 3rd. And so while there are obstacles to voting for many different populations, we wanted to specifically raise awareness about the obstacles faced by survivors of domestic violence. Some of these key barriers include withholding information, intimidation, and threats of physical violence, and concerns related to privacy. In terms of withholding information, perpetrators may keep information about the election from the survivor as a tactic to maintain control. This can involve restricting access to the internet or social media so that the survivor cannot obtain information about registration deadlines, how to apply for and return absentee or mail-in ballots, early voting schedules and locations, polling locations, the date and time of elections, or information about candidates and their positions. Perpetrators may use threats of physical violence or fear and intimidation to sway the survivor to vote for a certain candidate or party or to vote at all. With absentee ballots, there's also an increased concern that perpetrators may demand that survivors complete their ballot in their presence. and thus influencing who they vote for. It's important to note that election canvassers should refrain from referring to political party affiliation of respondents, particularly in front of potential perpetrators. One of the biggest barriers to voting for survivors of domestic violence is the issue of privacy, because when registering to vote, individuals are required to supply identifying information such as their home address, and survivors that have escaped abusive relationships may fear providing this information due to the threat of their abuser discovering their location. This information is kept in voter registration databases, which are made publicly available in some states and may be used by campaigns or organizations for get out the vote activities. In states that allow same-day voter registration, voters may register on election day and sign a written request stating that they wish to be excluded or removed from voter registration lists. However, this strategy requires that the individual re-register for every single election. One of the solutions to voting barriers for survivors of domestic violence is address confidentiality programs. These programs are available in the 29 states listed on the slide, and they allow people to register without their contact information becoming public record. The address confidentiality program provides enrolled individuals with a legal substitute address and a mail forwarding program. So individuals who are victims of stalking or domestic violence are able to register for free. It's also important to note, though, that those regulations vary by state. And some of the programs will still require that the individual provides an alternative address and may or may not accept shelter addresses. So expanding these programs can help protect survivors, but it's important to note that the state of residence and previous addresses and whether or not you are enrolled in an address confidentiality program may not be kept confidential. Another solution is to improve the accessibility of election information, which includes the safety of accessing such information. Websites with election information, including state and local websites, should all include an exit button or escape site to protect survivors browsing privacy. Get out the vote campaigns must be designed with survivors in mind. So for example, advocates and domestic violence organizations can leverage safe communication networks to provide nonpartisan election information to survivors. Additionally, election officials should be trained on how to identify and respond to signs of domestic abuse and how to assist survivors in voting safely. In general, voting should just be made easier for everyone. Democracy works best when all eligible Americans are empowered and able to vote. Polling places should be conveniently located and easily accessible. And pro-voter policies such as automatic voter registration, election day voter registration, and early and mail-in voting options are needed to allow survivors the flexibility to choose how they want to vote and to feel safe doing so.
Awesome. So as you can see, we kind of just threw a lot of information out there about a variety of different topics. And that's because the intersection of politics and domestic violence is just such a huge issue and very complex. And so, sorry, there are sirens going on in the background. We've posted a couple of discussion questions here because we were hoping that people might have kind of thoughts if they had interest coming into this event that they wanted to talk about, if they were particularly struck by anything, and kind of open it up for discussion. So essentially the questions we have so far to kind of get the ball rolling if people are interested is, what are other ways that you might see politics and domestic violence intersecting? Where are you from? That was one of the questions we asked in the beginning. So maybe the people in the UK or other places, what issues, maybe particularly in terms of domestic violence and politics, are unique to kind of your area? How does it maybe compare to what we've discussed with the United States, etc.? And then what do you think that we as allies can do? So let me see. Do we want to stop sharing my screen for a second? Stop share. And how, let's see, people can Okay, no worries if you have to hop off. Thanks for letting us know. People, if you either want to write a question or a thought inside of the chat or turn on your video and kind of flag us down to speak, we would definitely be interested in hearing people's thoughts.
Hello. Sorry, I'm in South Africa now. I got home a few days ago, and I'm just thinking that I don't know enough about South Africa's politics around laws and legislations to do with domestic violence. But I know that we have one of the highest rates of domestic violence in the world, and Johannesburg, certainly the city where I am, has one of the highest rape rates in the world. And so I think you've given me a lot of food for thought about thinking about the history of laws in South Africa and where those laws intersect with what kind of happens on the ground. Because I think in the South African context, it's very common for there to be laws in place, but what the laws say and what actually happens kind of don't match up. And in the US, that definitely happens in many parts of the country, but at least when there are laws, and I assume it's the same in Canada, where there are laws, you can kind of expect them to be carried out in some way or form. But in South Africa, often laws don't dictate what happens. So you've just given me a lot of food for thought in doing, I need to do some research on what happens in South Africa, because I know it's terrible and I care a lot about this issue. And yet I'm not sure what the laws are. And then I'm also not sure how those laws translate into action. So thank you for that history. I don't think I knew enough about it in the American context, but also need to do my research on this side, I guess.
Hey everyone. A couple of things I've been thinking about and how this domestic violence and politics all relate is obviously right now things in the US are very tumultuous, and I think in two different things happening right now that are going to directly relate our policies or affect our policies are obviously right now everything going on with Black Lives Matter and defund the police, in just thinking about on a kind of daily and personal basis people's trust of the police and who the first responders will be when they call these resources that they're being directed to. So that's definitely a timely conversation and thinking about how we can, whether through policy or through kind of grassroots organizations, start to think about the best ways to help survivors, especially women of color. And then secondly, with Amy Coney Barrett, thinking about how this is all definitely going to affect women's access to their bodies and the healthcare involved in that, and things, thinking about like birth control and partners' say in women's bodies and how that's going to kind of intersect with this conversation of domestic violence. So I just think, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about these too. I'm very stressed out, but we'll see.
Awesome. Thank you guys for sharing. I've also received another message from a participant in the chat asking, how does the average citizen help promote legislation? What can the average person do, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again so that we can continue the presentation. Because we'd like to discuss this a bit as we wrap up. So what can the average person do? I guess the first thing, this is kind of US focused, but obviously like this information, but obviously this kind of thing can be done wherever you are, but contact your legislators. And so we've included directions here about how to find who your legislators are. So that includes in the US, your representatives and your senators, and then how to look up kind of what the issues are. This was perhaps a bit easier before coronavirus because now everything's kind of shut down and it's a little confusing, but can still be done nonetheless. And so really feeling confident to reach out to your legislators and say that obviously so much is going on in the world, but we really care about VAWA being reauthorized, for example, or something like that. You have a lot of options to contact your legislators, obviously, telephone, email, snail mail, in-person meetings might be a little tricky now with COVID, et cetera. And so definitely go online. We can provide you with information about how to do this, and specifically how you can help with promote specific domestic violence legislation. We'll be kind of including that on our pages, especially our policy and advocacy newsletter. And so if you're not signed up for that and you're interested, please do let us know. And then secondly, Sanj, do you want to discuss a little bit about Get Out the Vote?
Yeah, so this is mainly for anyone who's in the United States right now and who are US citizens, but we would be remiss if we did not mention again that it is 1 week till Election Day, November 3rd. It's a Tuesday. Thank you to Caitlin for talking about barriers to voting for survivors. I think that reminds me especially that voting is not only a right, but it is also a privilege, and that all of us who are able should vote and should do so immediately. Just a few quick reminders: if you have a mail-in ballot right now and you have yet to send it in, if you are at all capable, please drop that off in person. So use your state election websites, go to your county commissioner's office, or use authorized Dropbox. If you are voting early in person or voting in person on election day, make a plan, know where your polling centers are, know the hours, and also know what ID requirements your state has. And when in doubt, bring extra ID copies. And wear a mask. Yes, wear a mask. But yes, vote. This may be one of the most consequential elections of our lifetime. And just let us know if you have any questions about that. Thanks.
Awesome. Really quickly, wrapping up, we just wanted to give everyone here information about us. Please feel free to email us about anything at COVID-19 Task Force dv@gmail.com, and make sure you follow all of our different social media pages, specifically Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, so that you can kind of see our work. And we'll have a lot about kind of the intersection of politics and domestic violence on our page. As I mentioned, we have a newsletter, etc. And so please do reach out if you're interested in receiving that newsletter, and check out our social media to kind of see the work in real time. Also, if you ever miss one of our seminar series or want to come back to look at something again from any sort of Zoom seminar, we have a YouTube channel, and so please do visit that. You can find all of this information on our website, which is www.covid19taskforcedv.org. And then really quickly, please feel free to sign up for more events for Domestic Violence Awareness Week. We still have events Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, so 3 more events, plus a day of action with recommended action steps for Saturday. And so you can sign up for more events at the link here, and you can also check out our designated website page. So it's our website /DV Week. And then additionally, we do have a Facebook event on our Facebook page. So if you want to share it with colleagues, friends, families, members, please feel free to do so. Here's the schedule for the rest of the week. So tomorrow we have an event on data. Thursday will be a moderated community discussion. And then Friday is a keynote address from Dr. Ruth Glenn, who is the CEO and president of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. As I mentioned, Saturday, we'll have a day of action where we ask people to donate to organizations, help print and post flyers with resource information that we've created around their home neighborhoods, and then of course, vote and get out the vote to others. So that is the end of our presentation. We'll be staying on. I'll be staying on if anyone has any questions, but thank you guys so much for attending, and hopefully we will see you again soon, maybe tomorrow. So thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.